Okay, thanks everybody for joining on Zoom and here in person. It's my great pleasure to briefly introduce Katie G. Salisbury, and then I'll hand off the floor to her. I first want to thank Pamela Crosson and the History Department. And I also want to thank Lucy Lee, who's joining us from the Yotie OSO Undergraduate Retention and Success Program and the AANHPI, Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Academic Success and Undergraduate Advising Team. Our guest today, Katie G. Salisbury, is an author and a really, I want to say scholar, because I think that this is really scholarly work in terms of the contribution that it's making here. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, MSNBC, Vanity Fair, The Ringer, The Believer, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and elsewhere. We'll share out some links a little bit later about the book that we're going to talk about here today. We're going to hear about Not Your China Doll, The Wild and Shimmering Life of Anna Mae Wong. And at the end of the session, we'll have some books to give away for any folks who join us in person and for some of our friends on Zoom. So we'll do a quick drawing at the end for those who haven't gotten their copy of the book yet. Thank you, Katie. Please join me in welcoming Katie G. Salisbury.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm always really happy and excited to speak about Anna Mae Wong. So I'm going to give about like a 45-minute presentation and gives you like a overview of her life and career. There's a lot more that happens that I can't cover here, but it's all in the book if you get a chance to do that. And we can move to the first slide, please. So who was Anna Mae Wong? She was born Wong Leo Song in 1905 in Los Angeles, and her Chinese name translates loosely to frosted yellow willows. She was the daughter of a laundryman, and both of her parents were born in Northern California. So the way I count generations, I would consider her a third generation Chinese American. So it's actually her grandparents who came over from China to the US during the gold rush. So, to be a third generation Chinese American in 1905, your family's been here for a while. So she's also the first American-born Asian actor to play a leading role in a Hollywood production. And across her 4-decade career, she basically worked in every single medium. She started in silent films, moved into talkies and sound, also did radio, theater, and then later TV in the 1950s. So a lot of milestones were broken over the course of her career. Next slide, please. So the photograph on the left is a photo of the Wong clan circa 1925. So that's her family. You can see a lot of kids. There were, I believe, 7 of them. And Anna Mae Wong is the young woman on the far right corner. She's standing behind her father, Wong Sam Sing. And so at the time that she was growing up, she and her older sister, Lulu, who's on the far left, they're the 2 eldest girls in the family. As anyone who comes from like a working class family who runs their own business knows, when you're not busy at school, you're helping out the business, and that was very much true for their family. So they were helping out the laundry when they weren't at school, making deliveries all across Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles. So one of the things they started to see during that time were film studios that had started and opened back east in New York and New Jersey began moving out to Los Angeles because they realized that they could be shooting films all year round with the great weather here, like on a day like today with endless sunshine, which was not the case back east. And also because back then they didn't have studios yet, they were filming outside. They needed the actual, like the literal sunlight. So they started moving to Los Angeles. They're setting up in the streets of downtown LA. They're also going to Chinatown because it's free atmosphere. They don't have to build a set. All they have to do is show up. I mean, this is before you used to have to get licenses to shoot places. So they were just in the streets, cranking their film. And so Anna Mae Wong sees this, and like a lot of young kids at the time, becomes really curious and enchanted by it. So much so that she starts, hanging around these sets every time they're filming something, and she gets known as the curious Chinese child. She's always there at the sidelines, asking a lot of questions. Pretty soon, she's also skipping school, using some of her lunch money or the tip money she gets from making deliveries for her dad's laundry to go to the films. and she's watching going to the Nickelodeons, watching the films run from reel to reel, and then racing home to reenact what she's just seen in front of the mirror. So by the time she's 11, she's basically decided that she's going to be a movie star. So, you know, most of us, we don't figure out what we're going to do with our lives, you know, maybe if we're lucky until like our mid-30s. But she knew at 11, and so she starts getting her foot in the door. Next slide, please. So she skipped school again. Actually, there was a pandemic, as many of you know, in 1918, and that gave her her lucky break because everything was shut down. So she had an excuse to go work on a movie set. So she's getting her foot in the door by playing extra parts. And then slowly she works up to small supporting roles. One of the first of those is Yotie, which we see a photograph of her here at 15 in that film. And the clipping to the left from the Los Angeles Times is one of her first interviews. And I always like to read the headline, you know, Native Orient unspoiled by success, dips her ivory hands in suds. And so they're kind of playing on the unusualness of not only a Chinese American working in the films, but also the fact that she's still working on her father's laundry while she's also making films. So she's, you know, very humble, very hardworking. But the other thing that they are constantly, and this becomes a theme in a lot of the media she does in her early career, is they're constantly, you know, harping on her appearance as this typical Chinese maiden, like something out of a Chinese poetry book, the 12th century. And so they have all these expectations about her based on what she looks like, except that as soon as she speaks to them, she has this, you know, American accent. She speaks like all the young flappers with all the lingo, and she's completely American in, you know, culture and the way that she behaves in the world. So it really catches people off guard. I mean, this is a period before people understood what it meant to be a hyphenated American, to be both Chinese and American, and that's really what Anna May Wong was. So you see this a lot in her interviews, where they'll describe her as this way and then say like she ruined it all by opening her mouth because she's just like everyone else. So I think that she really leans into this because she wants to subvert people's expectations of her, right? She wants them to understand that she is American. And so she really embraces her flapper persona, which you see on the far right. And we can make this a little bit so you can see it. But yeah, you saw that she embraced her flapper persona. So then on this slide, that's okay, you can, these are two films that become very important in her early career. The first one on the left is The Toll of the Sea from 1922, and she gets cast in a leading role at the age of 17. And one of the reasons this happens is because the film is being made by the scientists at Technicolor in cooperation with a film studio, but their major concern is showing off their color technology. They are not really concerned about box office receipts. They don't need a huge star to run this film. They've chosen specifically a Madame Butterfly tale, except they've set it in China. And they've chosen China as a backdrop because they want to have these really beautiful, colorful backgrounds. So, richly embroidered costumes, the antiques, and they want to show off the natural color of this new film stock, which means they're also willing to cast Asian actors in Asian roles, which was not the norm in early Hollywood. You had a lot of white actors who would be cast and play the roles in yellowface. So with the Madame Butterfly story, it had actually been done a number of times in Hollywood previously. So Mary Pickford had played it, Norma Talmadge had played it. So it was really an opportunity for Anna May Wong to show her chops in this part, which she realized. And she gives a virtuoso performance, is able to cry on cue in front of the camera. And when the critics see this film, no one is expecting anything great because the film has been done so many times, but they're really blown away by her talent. And the New York Times gives her a rave review saying that 9 out of 10 times this performance is botched, but hers is the 10th performance, and she deserves to be seen again and often on the screen. And I just always think, like, can you imagine getting reviewed at 17 by the New York Times? So this really gets her noticed in Hollywood. And so one of the important people who sees the film is Douglas Fairbanks, who's one of the biggest stars in the world at the time. He's such a big star that he now has his own studio with Mary Pickford. He produces his own films, so he's He stars in them, and he's working on his next blockbuster, which is an Arabian Nights themed tale called The Thief of Baghdad, and he's looking specifically for exotic types. And also he's a little bit different than his other colleagues in Hollywood. He actually wants to cast a really diverse group of people. So he wants people like Anna Wong. So he's seen her performance. He knows how talented she is. So he casts her in what becomes her unlikely breakout role as the Mongol slave in The Thief of Baghdad, which you see here. And she's, very scantily clad. I mean, this is 1924. So this is not, you would never see someone like wearing this little amount of clothing, especially not walking down the street. And so I think out of almost all of the cast, she's wearing the least amount of clothing, except for Douglas Fairbanks himself, who's bare-chested, as you can see. So Thief of Baghdad is shown around the world. It's a huge blockbuster. So it really launches her career in Hollywood. Next slide. And so I actually have a clip that a couple clips that I want to show from her early silent films. We're not going to play the whole thing, but you can go ahead and play and we'll kind of cut it off at a certain point. Yeah, we can cut it here. Sorry to, sorry to stop it. And people always get really into the films, but this reel is actually made by a fan, an Anime Wong fan, who has a YouTube channel called The Gallery of Anime Wong. So a lot of her films, which are public domain or just not really in distribution anymore, are available there. So you can go there and watch a lot more of them in detail. But yeah, we can move to the next slide, please. So Thief of Baghdad launches Anime Wong's career, and now she's kind of off and running, getting parts in a lot of other films. One of them during this time is called The Alaskan, 1924, and it actually happens that one of the cameramen is also Chinese American. His name is James Wong Hao. He actually becomes this Oscar-winning cinematographer, and so two of them are part of this cast and crew. And because it's set in Alaska, they're not actually going to go all the way to Alaska, but they're going to Canada to film it on location. And so this is also a kind of pivotal moment in Anime Wong's life where she realizes she's not like other Americans. As a Chinese American, she's essentially a second-class citizen, or maybe not even a citizen, because they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which bars the immigration of all Chinese laborers, very strict immigration law. So essentially anyone who was Chinese and already in the US had to prove their status. So you had to have identity papers on you at all times because people could ask for them. And when you were going to leave the country, you had to ask permission and be able to then, when you came back, prove who you were with your identity papers. So the cast and crew get to the border in Seattle. They're about to board a ship going to Canada, and they realize this legal issue that they have now because they've brought two Chinese Americans with them and neither of them have the correct paperwork. We don't know exactly what happens, but there is some kind of fuss that goes on about this. Somehow I think the studio is able to put their weight into the issue and they get it resolved. So next slide, please. So as you see here, they're able to leave the country, they go to Canada, they shoot the film in Banff, Canada, and they come back. But Anime Wong has just learned this really important lesson that she never knew because she'd never left the country before, that she needs all of these papers. So the papers on the left are her identity papers, her card. And you can see that it was issued to her in Seattle, Washington. Actually, when she gets back home from this trip, she pays to have all of her siblings go with her on a trip to Mexico so that they can then register their identity papers and they won't have the same issue later on. And then the form on the far right is called Form 430. This was the application you had to issue to your local immigration officer requesting to leave and explaining why you were leaving, what trip you were going on. And they would have to approve it. And then upon return into the country, you would be submitted to interrogation. So Anime Wong, probably one of the most famous Chinese Americans, had to go through this process. So you can imagine what it must have been like for just ordinary Chinese American citizens, probably a lot more rigorous and difficult. But the kinds of questions they would ask her were, basic information like where do you live, what's your profession, what were you doing overseas, but also who are your family members and where do they live and what are they doing? What are their professions? And here are some photographs. Can you tell me who this person is? Can you tell me who this person is? Sometimes they would show you a photograph of someone you didn't know because they're testing you. Do you know who this person is? So that's the kind of thing that you would have to go through. Next slide, please. So at the same time that she's learning what it means to be a Chinese American according to the law, she's also starting to butt up against some challenges in Hollywood because she is getting a lot of work, but it's not necessarily the work that she wants. She's getting a lot of bit parts, oftentimes playing kind of the floozy or dancing girl, the exotic type, who often dies in the end. Or she's maybe second fiddle to another lead actress who's actually white playing the part in Yellowface, as you see here on the far right. That's Renee Adderey, who's playing the lead in a film called Mr. Wu. And I think this clipping says that Anime Wong is trying to teach her how to read Chinese. There's another version of this where she's teaching her how to use chopsticks. This is kind of a recurring thing. She's not only a bit player in these films, but she's also like the cultural consultant, but she's not getting paid for that, right? And part of it, the issue is that Hollywood is under a lot of pressure to kind of clean up their act because they've had a lot of racy things going on both in their films and in Hollywood. And so the government is threatening to regulate them and they basically don't want things like interracial relationships depicted in films, or if they're depicted, it has to be a negative depiction, right? Where the relationship can't be consummated, somebody dies, meaning Anime Wong dies. So that's kind of the recurring issue, and they're telling her, sorry, you can't play leading lady roles because you'll be opposite a white guy, and then that's not gonna work out. But Anime Wong has proved that she's very popular with fans, and she's getting 500 fan letters a week. Everyone knows she's talented, and you can see here in the ad in the center for the Chinese Parrot, which was an early Charlie Chan film, they're actually using her image to advertise the film, making people think, oh, she's gonna be a big part of this film, right? Although the film is lost, we know from reviews that she only appears in the beginning and then she dies. She's just playing like the setup for the rest of this mystery. So she starts to get tired of this type of treatment in Hollywood because she believes that she's really talented. And, you know, we already saw that she played a leading lady role and was getting reviewed by the New York Times. So she wants more parts like that. Next slide, please. So this is an interview that she gives around this time in a movie magazine. And she says, you know, to tell the truth, I'm Chinese by race and I love Chinese people and things. My only regret is the limitation upon my work, as I can only play Oriental roles or sometimes Indian parts. Hayakawa starred and failed because he was never allowed to kiss the heroine. The fans wouldn't have stood for it. And Hayakawa, she's referring to is Setsu Hayakawa, who was this huge Japanese star in like around 1915. He was actually Hollywood's first heartthrob. So women went totally crazy for him. And he was in a number of stories that had kind of an interracial love element, but again, the relationships weren't consummated. That's what she's referring to here. And then, you know, the interviewer says, but surely no one objects to seeing an American kiss a pretty little Chinese girl. And she responds, well, not if she is impersonated by an American in yellow face. But you can tell she hasn't given up because, you know, she goes on to say, but someday someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl, then perhaps I'll have my chance. So she's kind of waiting for the perfect movie to come along that, you know, she can play the leading role, a sympathetic part, play a Chinese woman. So we'll keep that in our back of our head as we go through the rest of this. Next slide. So, you know, by this time, because she's so frustrated in Hollywood, she's actually circulated with a lot of expats who are working there, Germans, British. They really love her because she's very clever and funny. She's well-read, even though she didn't graduate high school. So she actually gets an offer to make a film in Berlin, in Germany, at their premier film studio called UFA. And they've written a film specifically for her to star in. So she considers taking the offer. It's a really big risk because no one has ever left Hollywood and come back and be able to retain their status there. You know, there's no telling what could happen there. She's 23, the farthest away from home she's ever been is Canada. She doesn't speak any German. And it's a really long way from Los Angeles, but in the end, she decides to bet on herself and she goes. And so her older sister Lulu, as you see here on the left, goes along as her chaperone and kind of acts as her manager as well. So they take a train to New York and then they take a boat and sail to Hamburg, Germany. And then you can see here in the middle clip from a German film magazine, her arriving at the train station in Berlin. She's got a bouquet of flowers. She's smiling. She's very happy. She was kind of almost immediately embraced by the Germans there. I mean, there were so few Chinese there that there wasn't really a kind of animus against them. Whereas in California and the West, there had been decades of campaigns to remove the Chinese, right, after they had finished their work on the railroad and other places. So there's a lot of hostility here towards the Chinese, whereas in Germany, she's just really viewed as this kind of unusual, you know, interesting, again, exotic woman, but they're very much embracing her. And so the first film that she makes is called Song. They've actually retitled it in honor of her Chinese name, Wong Song. You see the film poster for it here. It premieres in Berlin in the summer of 1928, and she receives a 20-minute standing ovation, is mobbed by the fans, and later says that she had like an out-of-body experience in that moment. And this is something that kind of continues as she goes across the continent of Europe. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. And so she's making films in France and in England. She goes to London, and she's basically like the talk of the town everywhere she goes. Like all of the publications are featuring her. We see a clipping of her here in London where she's visiting Limehouse, which is the Chinese quarter there. She's modeling silk shawls and silk pajama sets, really setting the trend. A lot of people want to now dress in a more like chinoiserie style. They're cutting their hair so they can have the blunt bangs. There's a bunch of different artists and photographers who are lining up to have her sit for them so they can capture her image. So she's really the toast of the town everywhere she goes. And she stays in Europe for nearly 3 years. And eventually this, her success there gets back to Hollywood. Next slide. So by the time she returns to the US, she sailed back to New York. As soon as she's getting off the boat, she intends to take a train back to Los Angeles to see her family because she hasn't seen them in 3 years. But as she's getting off the boat, she's actually accosted by a Broadway producer who is about to open a play called On the Spot, which is about a Chicago gangster. And he has a girlfriend who's Chinese and he wants Anna May Wong to play the part. So she basically commits to doing the role literally on the spot. And she's got 2 weeks to learn all of her lines and the entire, show. So it opens in 2 weeks on Broadway. It turns out to be a huge hit. And it runs for 5 months, not only in New York, but they traveled around a number of cities. And so she doesn't make it back to Los Angeles actually until the summer of 1931. And by that time, Paramount is finally ready to give her a 2-picture deal. And the first of those pictures is called Daughter of the Dragon. And they've basically created this as a starring vehicle for her. So finally, they're giving her a starring role. They brought over Sessy Hayakawa, who's pictured here, from Japan to play one of her love interest as another Asian man. The only thing is, this is a Fu Manchu film. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fu Manchu, but he's this basically, maniacal, evil Chinese genius that everyone is scared of. He represents the Yellow Peril. And so she's playing the daughter of Fu Manchu in this film, and Fu Manchu is played by Warner Oland, who's a Swedish actor. So again, he's playing the part in Yellowface, and it's all about her bloodlust to get revenge for her father. And it's a really lurid, silly script. It's not a great film, although it is worth watching because Travis Banton, who was the head costumer at Paramount, designed all of her costumes. So they're really beautiful. So you could tell they put a lot of money into this. They were trying to give her starring vehicle, but they were limited by their own imaginations because they could only see her in a Fu Manchu story, right? So it's not a huge success. The image from the right is one of her publicity stills, and you can see that she's autographed it. She's written "Orientally Yours, Anna May Wong," and that was kind of one of the cheeky things that she would do for certain fans. She understood that being Chinese American was what set her apart from other Hollywood stars, and so she definitely leaned into that. She, also said that with all of her clothing, she always tried to have some type of Asian element in it because she felt it was good for business. Next slide. So following Daughter of the Dragon, she does one more film at Paramount. It's Shanghai Express. I definitely recommend watching that. It's it is her best Hollywood film. Only she's not playing the lead. She's second to Marlene Dietrich, which is another whole long story that I won't get into, but it's very interesting and somewhat covered in the book. So following that, Paramount does not renew her contract. And in 1932, she has a really difficult year. Ironically, that year sees a lot of films in Hollywood that are China themed because there is actually an ongoing conflict in China and Japan. So they're kind of doing all these rip from the headline stories. But in the end, Anna May Wong doesn't get a part in any of those films. Most of them go to white woman playing the roles in Yellowface. And you can see here, she's written in a letter to her good friend, Carl Van Vechten. I made a test at Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studios for the leading role in The Son and Daughter. I guess I look too Chinese to play a Chinese because I hear Colleen Moore is going to do it. In the end, Helen Hayes actually played the role, who's pictured here on the right. And then on the left, that's Ramon Navarro, who is actually friends with Anna May Wong. He was a Mexican-American actor. And they, I guess, asked Anna May to do a little publicity stunt for them and makes things seem like they were all kosher. So they had Anna May visit the set while they were making this film and pronounce them, both, they looked authentically Chinese. So you can kind of imagine what it must have been like to have to, she auditioned for that part and didn't get it and then had to go on and say, oh yes, they look perfectly Chinese. So, she's in a difficult situation. Next slide, please. Around this time as well, another really important book is published called The Good Earth. Some of you may have heard of it or read it before in school. It's written by an American, Pearl S. Buck, who was the daughter of American missionaries in China, and she essentially grows up in China, fluent in Chinese, very fluent in kind of rural Chinese culture. And she writes this humanistic, sympathetic portrait of peasant farmers, two farmers, Wong and Oland. And when it comes out in the US, it becomes an overnight sensation, huge bestseller. And part of the reason is because when people read it, they're so surprised that how human and relatable the characters are. They forget that they're Chinese. So, this book was so popular, probably 1 in 4 Americans had read it by the end of the year that it came out in. She also wins the Pulitzer. And so Irving Thalberg, who's the boy genius at MGM, he sees this and he decides he's going to adapt this film and make a huge epic blockbuster out of it. And so that's what he does. He buys the rights for $50,000. So next slide, please. So you would think now that this is Anna May Wong's opportunity because it is a sympathetic portrait of the Chinese. There's a female role, a lead role for her. So I go back to the quote, right? Someday someone will write a story demanding a really Chinese girl, then perhaps I'll have my chance. And Anna May Wong had a lot of friends in the media. So they all start saying these things in the media. They're writing in their columns. Well, who do you think should play it? Or who do you think they're going to cast? Well, it should be Anna May Wong, right? She's the only Chinese-American actress of stature that everyone has heard of and who's a household name. So everyone's kind of putting their money on her. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Next slide. What MGM ultimately does is they cast Paul Muni, who's a white actor, to play the lead as Wong, a yellow face. And they use this as an excuse to say, well, sorry, Anna May, you can't play opposite him. He's a white actor and you're Chinese. That would be interracial, even though they're both supposed to be playing Chinese characters. So you can see the kind of hypocritical flawed logic of this whole thing. They just don't want to cast her in the role. That's it. And they're just finding a reason to give here. So then they cast Louise Reiner, who's a German actress who's just been in the US for about a year, who's still learning English. They cast her as the lead role of Olan. Yeah, so I mean, this is a major controversy in Anna May Wong's career. They do ask her to audition for a supporting role, which is essentially the tea house girl who seduces Wong and becomes his second wife. What I found in my research is that, well, what I think happened, according to my research, is that they don't even offer her that role. They offer her a smaller role, which is to support a lady in waiting to the second wife. In any case, Anna May Wong decides that she's not going to be a part of this production. So there is this huge hypocrisy here, right? MGM says that they're trying to make a sympathetic, authentic film about the Chinese. And actually, they've spent a lot of money on pre-production. They spent several years sending scouts to China to study all of these things. They've bought farms wholesale and shipped them back to Hollywood to rebuild. They bought 500 acres in Chatsworth to have, and they have all these Chinatown extras to come farm it. They've studied all the dress, the hairstyles, all of these things, but they can't bring themselves to cast Asian actors in the principal roles. And yet they're still willing to brag here in the ad to the right from Max Factor Makeup about their realistic yellow face makeup. This is not like the silly Fu Manchu makeup. This is serious, realistic makeup. So Anna May Wong decides, I'm not going to be a part of this production and I'm going to do something else instead. Next slide, please. She basically produces her own counter narrative by announcing that she's going to go on her first trip to China in 1936. She takes along a photographer and cameraman. His name's Newsreel Wong, and he documents her travels, and she later makes that into a documentary that she narrated. He also writes a 5-part series for the New York Herald Tribune, which you see here on the far right, about her experiences and first impressions of China as an American. And those, essays are syndicated across the country in newspapers. On the far left, we see her arriving in Shanghai. So you can see like all the people who are there like waiting for her. She has this really triumphant arrival. But it's also a super meaningful trip for her too, right? Because she's trying to understand as a Chinese American who's never been to China before, what that means. Like, what are her roots? Where did her family come from? What is the culture really about? So she learns Mandarin, spends time in Beijing. The photo here of her in the Moon Gate is, I think, one of her friend's gardens in Beijing. And she really loved the walled gardens there. So when she comes back to the US, she builds her own home in Santa Monica and built the Moon Gate into her garden and actually names the entire house Moon Gate. So that was a really important thing for her. And then she also goes, as you see in the far right photograph, out into the farm, the rural places to speak with actual Chinese farmers. So I do actually talk a lot about the Good Earth in my book, even though she's not in that film. And part of the reason was that I wanted to give people the split screen of her trip to China and what Hollywood was manufacturing this image of China, to give you a sense of like the two disparate things. But yeah, this trip becomes a very meaningful thing for her. Next slide. And while she's actually in China, despite it, people are really excited to welcome her. There's also a lot of criticism that she receives. People are not happy about the types of roles she's played in the past, the scantily clad Mongol slave, the floozies, the evil, evil helpers, the dragon ladies. And they're asking her, like, why did you play all these roles? They make us look bad. They make everyone think that all Asians or Asian women are like this. And, she tries to explain to them that she didn't always have control over the types of roles she could play. She had to take them or not work at all. But despite, they don't totally understand her. Despite that, she really does take a lot of the criticism to heart. And whether it's fair or not, she comes to understand that her image really does kind of work as a symbol of Chinese and Asian people everywhere, because she has such great visibility. When people see her, that's what they think of all Asian people. And I mean, that's an impossible responsibility, but that kind of is the reality of her situation. So when she comes back to the US, she does a couple of things very publicly. She says, Hollywood won't cast Chinese actors in Chinese roles, and that's her way of saying Hollywood is racist, which I think is a really brave thing to do in 1937, and no one else is really talking about this type of thing. She also says that she's no longer going to play unsympathetic roles. And she's able to, instead of, you would think if she came out and said these things, people are like, okay, well, we're not going to work with you anymore. We're going to blacklist you. The incredible thing is that it's the exact opposite, because she's been very shrewd. And one of the other things that she learns while she's in China is that she runs into her old friend, Warner Oland, the Swedish actor, who's now become famous for playing Charlie Chan. And when he goes to China, the Chinese people embrace him. They love him because they love Charlie Chan. He's a positive role model. He's a detective. He solves crimes. They tell Warner Oland, oh, you look Chinese. You could be a real Chinese. And meanwhile, all the newspapers are criticizing Anna May Wong. They're saying she's old and her clothes are ugly and she doesn't know anything about Chinese history and she should be deported, blah, blah, blah. So she's like, well, if they're going to embrace him because he plays a positive role model, then why can't I play a female version of Charlie Chan? So she goes to Paramount Pictures and she has lunch with an executive there. And she tells him about her idea and says, well, who do you think I should pitch it to? And as soon as she says that, they're like, well, why aren't you pitching it to us? Like, we should have that idea. So that's how she gets her next series of pictures at Paramount in the late 1930s. The first of them here is the photograph in the center, Daughter of Shanghai in 1937. She and her childhood friend, Philip Wong, who's a Korean American actor, play the leading roles in this film. He's actually playing an FBI agent, which someone noted to me probably predates an actual Asian American becoming an FBI agent by a couple of decades. So in that sense, it's kind of visionary. And all of the villains in the film are played by white actors. And unlike her previous, her early films, she doesn't have to die in the end. She gets a happy ending with the Philip Bond character. And they become the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic couple in the Sound era. So really revolutionary for 1937. Another film from this period that I also really like is King of Chinatown from 1939 in the upper right corner. It's a fictionalized biopic of Dr. Margaret Chung, who was the first Chinese American woman to become a doctor. And the thing that I really love about that film is that it also has a lot of slices of life of Chinese American life during that period. She's playing a surgeon, but her father is a traditional Chinese herbalist. So you can kind of see the clash of the generations. During Chinese New Year, she invites her coworkers home from the hospital to have Chinese New Year dinner with her family. So it's really a very, very touching film. And I can't, I haven't seen all the films from the 1930s, but I don't think a lot of them showed that type of thing. So again, really revolutionary. And, so you can see that despite not getting a part in The Good Earth, her trip to China really changes her life and her career. Next slide. So there's a lot more that happens, but that's kind of the basic summary of her life. And just to review some of the big milestones, she's the first American-born woman of color to play a leading role in a Hollywood production, which was in The Toll of the Sea. She's the first Chinese-American movie star. She might be cinema's first interracial kiss, which was in a British film called Job Ahead in 1934. And then, together with Phil Bong, they're the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic couple. And then the photograph here is actually a behind the scenes shot from a TV series that she created in 1951 called The Gallery of Madame Liu Song with Dumont Television. She plays a woman who runs an art gallery and travels around the world solving art crimes. Unfortunately, the tapes are lost because the television company went out of business shortly thereafter, a couple of years after this, but everyone is still hoping that one day it'll turn off. But certainly it was a groundbreaking show, made her the first Asian American to lead a television show. So you can see she kind of did it all and was working for her almost entire adult life since she was 14. Next slide. So yeah, so that's my talk. And if you want to learn more or kind of continue the journey, I also write a newsletter called Podcast Woman, where I talk about other issues related to Anna May Wong or other people who were kind of in her world from that era. And of course, I'm on social media as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They gave us a lot to think about, and I want to open the floor to others for any questions. Anybody in Zoom can either type their questions or raise their hand virtually or jump right in. Is that somebody already with a hand up? Lucy, was there a question or a raised hand there?
Someone was just sharing, I believe it was Robbie, that was just sharing that they thought it was the excellent presentation and the thank you to Katie for this presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Robbie, for joining.
Can I also just mention one other thing quickly? I do have some postcards here if you guys want to take some. One is a map of Anna May Wong's Los Angeles. So if you actually want to retrace her steps, there's a QR code on the back that goes to the addresses. Not all of them are still around, but some of them are. And then I also have these fun postcards that I made that are basically AI art reimagining Anna May Wong in like popular films. So I'm happy to take one of those as you leave.
Thank you. That's really cool. And then at the end, our attendees here in person have copies of the book. Katie said that she would sign, but we do have a few minutes for questions. And also I do have several books left over. So we'll do a quick sort of informal guess the number at the end drawing. And then some of our Zoom attendees will also have copies of them to pick up. Was there, John? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's in one of the documents that said that she had a scar from her left thumb. Do you know where that was from or?
What it was from?
Yeah.
No.
That's what I would ask.
Maybe working in
I'm
laundry.
assuming that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Question, but there was a LA Times article early on in your presentation, and I think the title was Made of the Orient, Unspoiled by Success.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that could be seen like as an early instance of depicting like the model minority. I don't know, later, like, the representations weren't very favorable. So I wonder if that like unspoiled by success, like hardworking.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, It certainly does fit into that type of narrative. I don't think it was as widespread then, but that was a part of a lot of her interviews would talk about how she wasn't really like a typical actress, how she was really down to earth and was like a normal, hardworking person. So yeah, that's an interesting thing that you picked up on.
We have a question from someone in the chat, Jonathan. And their question was, do you think the accepting of the critical roles by Anna May Wong hurt her career or gave her chances to further it?
I think ultimately it did give her chances to further it. I think, you know, the early parts that she's playing in the 1920s that are all these like not great roles, the ones where she has to die. I mean, even the ones that are better roles, a lot of them she still has to die, right? And in very ridiculous ways. So I do think she had, in a way, she had to take those roles. It was, you know, you can play this role or not, and we'll find someone else to do it. So if you're in that situation and you want to be an actress, you kind of have to say yes. And I think that just gave her more visibility and it did increase her popularity, but it took her some time. I mean, you have to remember too that she was so young when she started as an actress. So she was a teenager. So she was not really thinking about what she meant symbolically to other people. So it took a while for her to kind of experience a lot of these challenges in the industry and understand what her image meant to want to change it, right? And then she has to get really creative about how she does that. And some of the stuff we didn't go into that's in the book, you know, she has other periods where she goes back to Europe. I mean, she's always basically every time Hollywood shuts her out, she has a new plan. Like, okay, I'm going to go back to Europe and I'm going to do a cabaret tour. And now I'm going to go to China and produce this whole, you know, China tour. So I think that and then you see what she does when she comes back to Paramount in the late 1930s. So her thinking really evolves around the types of roles that she's taking. And it changes a lot too later in the 1940s and in the 1950s when she's doing TV. I mean, the types of roles she has to take then are very different from her early career.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Jonathan, for your question.
Quick question about that. I forgot about that, or missed that quote about the audience wouldn't stand for it. Which is the audience wouldn't stand. I was wondering, in film studies and in literature studies, there's always this question of audience, and then there's the author, creator, but also the publishers, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the production companies and that kind of thing. Where do you locate that? She said the audience wouldn't stand for it. There are sort of clear villains in terms of sort of D.W. Griffith making The Birth of the Nation, very clearly racist film. And then there are these pre-code films, and then there's the code, which we can point to. In those early films, and her being sort of forced into these roles of these limited stereotype roles, that she also makes the most of, and she makes these really meaty performances from. Where do you think that is, and is one ahead of is the audience really the reason, or are there sort of policing voices within the production houses, or is it a combination of the two? It's so hard to pinpoint, and it's such a huge country. Los Angeles itself is already a big town. Can you point to precise things, or do you think there's a cultural, I don't know, it's a sort of wide open question, but who is leading this sort of very deliberately structured racial definition of acceptable roles, even in pre-code Hollywood? Or is it kind of self-policing and assumption that these sort of racial codes are going to be required?
Right. I mean, it's definitely an evolution and a little of both, but I think Sesu Hayakawa is a good example, right? I think you picked up on something in that interview, because I think the element with him is that he's a man, right? Potentially interested in white women. And that's like a big no-no, right? Like hands off white women. But his movies, you know, they're pre-code, so they could get away with those things. And they were wildly successful. I mean, the 1915 The Cheat is when he becomes famous. And that's what makes him a Hollywood heartthrob. I always try to remind people, like, the first Hollywood heartthrob was an Asian man. And, but he's playing this kind of villainous character where he's kind of tricked this white woman who has she's like gambled money away and she needs him to help repay her debts. So she owes him money. It's a secret that she's keeping from her husband. And at one point he brands her. I mean, this is like a very typical thing they do in films, like the evil person will brand someone. And it's kind of like it is in a way like a rape fantasy, right? And the thing is that film makes him a star, and all these white women are like completely enthralled with him. There's stories about him arriving somewhere in his limousine and it's raining, and all the fans there, they throw down their fur coats on the puddles so he doesn't have to touch the damp, floor. So I can understand why Hollywood wouldn't want him to actually, like, the relationships couldn't be consummated, right? Because that was a huge no-no. But and then, the interviewer is saying, but a white guy kissing an Asian woman, what's wrong with that, right? That's fine. So to get back to your question though, I think with her, I think there's a little more nuance, right? Because I think that it would have been a little bit more permissible. Because men wouldn't have been angry about it. But there's also this evolution going on in Hollywood, right? They're under pressure to change the way that they're making films. They don't want this type, the government doesn't want that type of thing. And then they really codify it with the production code in 1930. So there's a lot of gray there. And I think where I come down ultimately is that I think it really came down to the producers and the gatekeepers, because number one, the fans did want her because she's getting all these fan letters. And people are writing into magazines, like with the one film, Mr. Wu, where Renee Adderey plays lead. This fan writes in and says, why did you put Renee Adderey in the lead role when you have Anna May Wong? Like, you have a real Chinese actress. So why wouldn't you put her? Like, I want to see her. So people are kind of complaining that the studios won't put her in. So I don't think it's moviegoers are ready for her. They want her. And then you have a lot of statements from other people in the business, whether they're screenwriters or directors who've worked with her. They know how talented she is, and they comment like how sad it is that they can't give her a role that's worthy of her. So I think it really comes down to the producers and what they think is acceptable for the public. But granted, they're also under pressure from other places. And then if you think about it too, a lot of the producers and heads of studios, they're Jewish. So they themselves want to be seen as more American. So they kind of also have to toe those racial codes. And I think that's why you get to the place you do in the 1930s, where it's really strict and it's almost impossible for her to work.
It's really interesting, so much to think about. And I'm also thinking about just how big the United States is at this point, from the height of Jim Crow, this idea that there are going to be parts of the country where it may be fine, like Los Angeles, maybe, or parts of Los Angeles or major northern cities. But then this idea that we've got to maximize the number of theaters where people can see this. And so
That's a really good point too.
I mean, we can't just have the German audience or the English audience. We got to try to get Alabama as well.
Yeah, and the states had their own censorship boards, I believe. I don't know if they all had them, but because there's some production files that will tell you what they censored in different states from specific films. Yes.
So much to think about. I think there might have been another. Lucy, was there another comment in the another chat question that came up?
Yes, I mean, I have a question as well. I was like, this resonates a lot with me growing up as a second gen Chinese American. And just, it's a pleasure to be able to always learn more about historical figures and people that really existed, that, the things that they did in their own sense combat even struggles that I feel like I face today, even in the media industry now. If we were to even look at our music industry, K-pop or C-pop, J-pop, etc., a constant part of that discussion is, even visually, it's like, oh, well, what's your proximity to whiteness? And therefore, what comes with that? And how far away or how close you are to it also dictates what you can and can't do, which again, I find fascinating. I guess my question is for Katie is, what was your favorite self-discovery or maybe evolution in your identity or perspective while you're putting this book together?
Oh, that's a great question, which I'm not sure. Let me think about that for a second. So I'm part Chinese and I grew up in Arcadia, so not too far from here, and my mom was born in Chinatown in Los Angeles. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I'm so drawn to Anna May Wong is that I see a lot of my mother in her, I see a lot of other Asian American women in her, but I think my family story is similar, I mean, except for the Hollywood part, but our families are from the same part of Southern China. My family is also based in LA. My great grandfather was kind of a well-known person in Chinatown and probably might have crossed paths with Anna May Wong. And so like when I first learned about her, yeah, I just thought, oh, that's interesting. That's similar to my own family. And so in a way, and I write about this I think like the preface to the book, which is a more personal piece that's in the book, about, I guess like going through her entire life, there were moments of things that she did that I felt like I could relate to. I mean, there's one of the really beautiful moments in this documentary she makes about China. She goes and visits her father's ancestral village, and she hasn't seen her father in a number of years at that point too. And there's this beautiful footage where they're walking arm in arm and you can kind of see the rice paddies, and it's like, that late afternoons, the light is really beautiful. And it just I had gone on a trip myself to visit my grandma's ancestral village in southern China, and it was also really meaningful to me, even though it was like difficult to communicate with the people there, and no one in my direct family actually lives there anymore. But like watching her do that, 100 years ago in this documentary kind of brought tears to my eyes, because it was like, wow, like I've had the same experience. And I think it is really validating to see a famous person kind of go through that, and then in a way like normalizes it when you don't actually normally see that thing in media. So I guess maybe one of the things I realize is just how important someone like her is. Like, she's obviously very important to me, but I know that she's important to other people for similar reasons. And I have a little different relationship to being Asian American too, because I'm half Chinese, and so that's a whole other thing. Different conversation.
See your Substack for probably
Oh,
more.
yes, yeah.
More meditations on that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't think there are any additional questions in the chat for now.
And I have a bunch of students here are in a writing seminar. So I was wondering, Katie also has a lot of experience in editing and putting together other people's books. So I was wondering if you could give a little insight into effective writing practices and some distilled wisdom that you earned putting together for this really mighty book. In terms of your writing process, what you've learned about research and writing and words in the page.
Yeah. Sure. I think research can be really fun, but it can sometimes also be procrastination. So you always have to find the right balance between the two. And that's the hard thing too, when you're writing about something that requires research. You can't start writing even when you want to, because you've got to do some of the work. And, it was definitely like a trial and error with this book. I mean, even though I've worked on other people's books, it's not really the same thing until you're doing it yourself. And there were probably periods where I spent a little too much time on research and could have started writing, but I tried to kind of go back and forth as I was doing each chapter and like research enough where I felt like I had a basic sense of where I thought the chapter would go. And then as I was writing, if I needed more specific information, I could do one-off searches and databases and things like that. So I think it's always like, try to get to the writing as soon as you can, like just do enough research that you have a sense of where it's going. Deadlines really help with this book. I started working on this during the pandemic. So I got a extension on the deadline, as did many people, because I couldn't go to archives and it was, a crazy time. But I wrote the first half of the book probably over an entire year. So I had a lot of time to work on it and change it and think about it and keep changing it. And I really labored over it. And then the deadline started to loom, and I basically wrote the second half in 6 months. It felt like, the two experiences were like night and day, because I basically was on a schedule. Every day I had to write at least 1,000 words, and it was grueling in a sense. So the deadline really helped. And if I had known that, you can do it in a way where you like make it a little bit nicer for yourself. You don't have to like rush it in the end. So that's the lesson, but I think deadlines, if you're like not making progress, like find a way to give yourself a deadline or have someone who's gonna keep you accountable, or taking a class is a great way. You definitely have deadlines in classes. And then the other thing that I do is just like a trick. This works for me. I always have a hard time when I'm starting to write something. It's like the scariest part is starting. So usually I kind of ease into it I'll just say like, well, this is the day when I have to start. And on the first day, it's like, well, if I can just write 200, 300 words, then that's okay. If I can do more, great. But if that's all I can do on that day, that's okay. And I'll just keep working up to a higher word count, because I find that once you kind of get into it, then you start flowing, you have momentum, you have more ideas, and it's not so scary. And you can also edit things as you're going. So I use that as a trick to just force myself to get started.
3 great. Pay attention. I'm gonna also take that to heart. We can move toward wrapping up. This has been a really a wonderful delight, and I have a limited number of books, and so what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna put my email address in the chat really quick, and while supplies last, I will okay, there we go. While supplies last, we have a few extra copies, so email me there and you'll get, unfortunately, not a personally inscribed copy, but maybe just a.
I can still sign them.
Yeah, a signed copy of the book, great. And thanks so much to everybody for joining online. Drop me an email, send me an email at that address in the chat. And you'll have a copy from Katie G. Salisbury of her terrific book, Not Your China Doll. Please join me in thanking and applauding Katie G. Salisbury. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and also thank you, Katie, so much again for a wonderful
you.
session. Thank you.
Thanks.